Well, in 1894 to 1896, we have the massacres that happened during this time, and it was committed or organized by this man, Abdul Hamid, aka the Bloody Sultan. I'm going to go through some of the main points that happened during this time that should be noted. First off, we have the Sosin Uprising. Now, the Sosin Armenians were mountaineers by nature, and they were levied heavy taxes from the Ottoman government, as well as levied heavy taxes from the local Kurdish chieftains. Now, this caused a lot of discontent among the locals, and they rose up and protested, and the Ottomans construed this as rebellion, so they sent in the Ottoman regulars to crush this rebellion, they would say, killing a lot of them. And one more, we have the Hunchakist demonstration in Constantinople. The Hunchakist organization was one of the Armenian rebel resistance factions I mentioned earlier. They were trying to get more rights for the Armenians. Now, the day before the organized protest, they submitted their plan to the Ottoman capital and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to march on your capital. We're going to protest our rights. It's going to be very formal. And the plan was accepted. The next day, old men, women, children, and young men all gathered and started, with their picket signs, and they marched on the capital. In the eyewitness testimonies of several foreign ambassadors as well as Turkish officials, Turkish police, lined up with cudgels and proceeded to beat the crowd to death. They spared no one, not even the old men or women and children or pregnant women. They killed most of them as well. It was very terrible. One more, perhaps the most famous of this time period, is the Zeytun Uprising. Zeytun is a town in the middle of Turkey, and what happened was about 200 Armenians, suspecting that the massacres were going to take place, organized a defense there, and they managed to hold off thousands of Ottoman regulars who moved in to try and stop this rebellion, they called it, but it was really a defense. The Armenians lost, maybe a dozen or so, dozens, and the Ottomans lost thousands, or not thousands, hundreds and hundreds of men. It was very humiliating defeat, and the battle only ended because the Armenians ran out of ammunition because they were killing so many Ottomans, and they had to retreat into the mountains. Well, this successful story, although it's very heroic and it inspired and continues to inspire Armenians to this day and of that time, the Ottomans took out their vengeance and humiliation for this defeat on the local neighboring Armenian villages. So ultimately it was a heroic resistance, but Armenians suffered because of it. Now, one more, we have the massacre at Van. Very similar to the Sosin uprising, the Armenians at Van were levied heavy taxes all over the place, and they rose up in protest, and Ottomans swept through and massacred a great deal many of them. And last, we have the capture of Bank Ottoman. This is really noteworthy. Quite a few young men, about my age or so, stormed the local bank, the National Bank, Ottoman, and held it for a good while, several days, I believe. And they did not kill a single bank employee, and they did not take a single unit of currency out of that bank. This earned a lot of attention from the West, and they granted safe passage for the Armenian rebels to leave the country and be exiled to Europe. Now, again, all they wanted was to have their rights respected, to have their voice be heard, so to speak. But the Ottomans did not like this, that they could not take back their own bank, and that the Europeans actually had to step in to mediate the ordeal. So the Turks took out their vengeance, as in the Zeytun uprising, on the local Armenian villages. All in all, in 1894 to 96, about 250,000 Armenians were killed. Now, The Ottoman Empire, it should be noted, was collapsing for about 100 years or so. Turks were losing wars and territory, and they were forced to sign treaty after treaty. Um, Bulgaria proclaimed its independence after suffering 2 massacres at the hands of the Ottomans, and that goes for Macedonia as well. The Turks also had to suffer the humiliating defeat of the Balkan War in 1912, and that's where they had to sign some very serious treaties where they actually had to take them seriously. On February the 8th, 1914, the Reform Agreement was signed as a result of the Balkan War. That was to give the Armenians the rights that they had been clamoring for decades. Among the things that they got Armenian representation in the local Congress, you could say, and they also had foreign inspectors general to come in to make sure that the reforms were being implemented. It was a very good time. Now, this reform agreement was initiated by the Russians, it should be noted, which for quite a long while it has been the worst enemy of the Turks. As a result of losing the Balkan War, the Ottomans lost 70% of its European population and lost 85% of its European territory. It was a great loss for both not only their population losses just from the loss of territory, but also the loss of personnel through war and whatnot. This was a time when the Armenians launched their huge campaign for human rights, and while the Turks were in deep mourning over all the things that they were losing and their crushing defeats, the Armenians were clamoring for rights, and the Turks resented that very deeply. They thought that the Armenians were very ungrateful. Now, the Turkish leaders were very much afraid of a repeat of the Balkan War when the Armenians were clamoring for their rights. They did not want the Armenians to rebel and proclaim independence like the Bulgarians did, but the Armenians made it very clear that they did not want their own country. They did not want to proclaim independence. All they wanted was to have their rights respected and to have a little bit of representation. Now, I guess it should also be noted that the Armenians were very, very prosperous. I think I noted this in the intro. They, for quite a long, long while, the Armenians were kind of pressured to go into business and trade, and they had to emphasize education very much so. And what this ended up happening was that while the Turks were living in most Turks were living in poverty and whatnot, most Armenians had a pretty high standard of living. The Turks resented this as well. Now, what should be noted about this reform that was signed on February 8th, 1914, to give all these rights to the Armenians was that there was something we can call common law versus written law. Now, for centuries and centuries, it has been understood in the Ottoman Empire that Armenians are second class to Turks, that the Turks are the superior race and the Armenians are the subordinate race, that they're the infidels. Not only were the Turks okay with this for centuries, but so were the Armenians. They were perfectly content to be second class. But during the 1800s, they started getting the ideas that they could actually get some rights, that they could actually be respected, and they started having a voice as a result of the humanitarian interventions that were going on during the humanitarian intervention was a really big deal in the West during this time, and they focused on the Armenians because they were Christians, and not so much, of course, on the Muslims.